pray. God of the ages, whose almighty hand leads us forth to celebrate where we have been and to ponder where we are going. We lift our gratitude for your presence with us today, for the gifts that sustain us for the journey of life, for the witness we have inherited from those who have gone before us, and for the legacy we are creating for those who will come after us. We pray in thanksgiving. As we gather today as the Donegal Society members and friends, we ask that your strong arm ever be our sure defense. Increase within us your true religion, and may your overflowing goodness nourish us in peace and hope. Lead us, we pray, with our eyes fixed upon your glory, for we pray in the name of Jesus Christ our Lord. Amen. I begin by welcoming all of you to this very special day and to what I hope might be a moment that points us forward with a renewed energy and vision for the Donegal Society. As I said to the folks in worship this morning, after having watched the Belmont Stakes yesterday, and the horse that won was a horse by the name of Mo Donegal, maybe that's a good word for us as we gather together today. We need some Mo Donegal, don't we? I would be remiss if I didn't begin by offering thanks to the Executive Committee and for their tireless efforts in serving the ends for which this society exists. All of their names are in the program today, and if you have not received a program, you can raise your hand and someone from the back will see you and provide you with this so that you can also see the names and the order by which we are doing our work today. But I especially want to extend my thanks to Phil Landis and to his Acorn Farms for the wonderful, lovely meal that they served today. I can't begin to tell you all the hard work that took for them to gather all the different kinds of foods. We forget that food that comes from the 18th century was made with recipes that used all sorts of different kinds of ingredients than what you and I use today. I mean, we pop it in the microwave. They didn't. And so we are grateful, Phil, for what you've done. To John Landis, to Tanya Kevorkian, who you'll meet in just a bit, for you being here and for being a part of this, to Barry Lee, who we will meet outside in a few moments after the meeting concludes, and to Marlene Arnold, who I'll introduce to you later, to the pie bakers, and I might say this, Portia, you reminded me of this, at 2 o'clock, Montgomery pies will be served. If you don't eat them all, the rest of them will be for sale. That's right. So you'll have to see someone. They'll be about, and someone will provide them.
Harry and George Leiter.
Okay. Yeah. Okay. They'll have them there. So to the cemetery reenactors, if it begins to rain at 3 o'clock,
2:45.
at 2:45. I'm sorry. The reenactors will be here in the sanctuary looking out the window because I know you'll mind it if it's raining while they won't mind it out there. But we do want you to know that if that happens, come here to the sanctuary, and I think you'll find that very entertaining and very informative. But if not, it will happen in the cemetery grounds. To those that have created the flower arrangements, for all of the activities, and for the students from Millersville who are here today, who you'll meet during the cultural fair, and I hope you'll introduce yourself to them and they to you, and to the Red Rose Scottish country dancers who are also here today and who will be performing later after we finish our time together. I am grateful for the support of the Donegal Presbyterian Church, and for this congregation's relationship to the society and the society's relationship to this congregation. And while our objectives are centered around the history of this church and the grounds upon which it is located, it's also our desire to allow that history to have a future. That the early Scots-Irish Presbyterians who began to worship here well over 300 years ago are being represented by a new congregation of people proclaiming the gospel of Jesus Christ and changing the lives of all who are touched by their witness. And so we're grateful for them, and we continue to pray for the ministry of this congregation, for Matt Randolph, the pastor, for the session and leadership, and for all that they're doing here on this spot where people once before gathered to sing their praises to God. And so welcome to this day and to this gathering. I want to begin by quickly going through the Donegal Society reports. You have received, I think, in the packet minutes from our previous reunion meeting. You should have received a financial report, a budget for 2022, and a membership summary. I am pleased to say to you that membership has increased by 5 since last we met, and the membership of the Donegal Society is now at 223 people. I do want to encourage any of you who are here today that are not a member of the Donegal Society or would like to become a friend of the Society. We welcome you, and we hope that you will come and be a part of what we're trying to do here, and what we're hoping will continue into the future. Lisa?
Yes, I would like to make a motion.
Okay.
That having received the minutes and the treasurer's report with today's program, I move that we accept the minutes of June 15th, 2021 annual reunion meeting, and accept the treasurer's report for 21 and the 2022 budget. Also, elect the nominated slate of officers as presented in the 2022 reunion program, and ratify actions of the executive committee where required from the last reunion meeting.
Which there aren't any, but
Just in case.
is there a second to that motion? It's been moved and seconded. Are there any questions that anyone has? Bruce Lippert, who's our treasurer, is not here. Lisa, who's our secretary and chair of the nominating committee, is. Noble always can answer questions about our finances, if there are any questions. If not, all in favor say aye.
Aye.
And opposed, the same sign. It is so moved. Thank you very much. Again, I want to thank the executive committee and the officers of the Donegal Society who have served over this last year. John Craig, who has been our second vice president. John is not with us today. He's in an airplane headed to the West Coast and to join his family on a cruise. Bruce Limpert, who's ill, who's our treasurer, is not here. To Lisa Kustra, who's serving as our secretary and is going to continue to do that. To our historians, who will meet in just a moment, Portia Bryan and Margie Sulisi. To our solicitor, Sam Slaymaker, and for the trees and grounds, to Paula Light and Mitch Forey, neither of whom are here. Paula because of health issues, and Mitch because he went to the shore, although he was here yesterday to help set things up. But I would mention on their behalf that they have worked very, very hard, continuing with the trustees of this congregation to deal with the trees and the grounds and helping to care for all of this property. And if you've not walked around the property, I hope you'll do so before the day is done. It's a lovely spot here, and someone was telling me just earlier they came here and had pictures for their engagement, and how lovely a place to come and to do something like that. So we thank all of you. I want to now turn to John and to Phil and to Tanya. A musical interlude.
Hi. So we have worked out a plan whereby I will say a few words of introduction, and then we will perform a couple of short selections. And actually, my introduction probably will be longer than the selections because those are very short. My colleague, Marlene Arnold, she was interested in pulling together experiences and cultural expressions of various ethnic groups that were in this area in the 18th century, and so I am going to talk about one group specifically. We know a lot about a consecration service in Lancaster City of a Lutheran church there of the Holy Trinity, which is still there on Duke Street. And in kind of a convoluted way, a scholar in Germany became aware a few years ago that some of the music was by the Baroque composer Georg Philipp Telemann, who was a contemporary of J.S. Bach's and, say, of George Frederick Handel's. And Telemann was very prolific, and he also published a lot. He published a lot of cantata cycles, annual cantata cycles, and those were published, and he made a lot of money from them. And so they were known throughout German-speaking, Lutheran, and even Catholic areas. Telemann's lifespan, I just thought about this last night. It coincides almost exactly with that of colonial Pennsylvania. So Telemann was born in 1681, which is the year that William Penn received his charter from King Charles II. And he lived an unusually long life for that time until 1767. And so Trinity was consecrated after a 5-year construction process, which had its ups and downs, but it was consecrated in 1766. So Telemann probably did not hear about the performance at Trinity, but over the course of 2 days, 2 entire cantatas from a 1740s cantata cycle were performed, and portions of 3 other cantatas were performed. So a cantata is a form of church music, and this form of cantata, it's a form of church music often framed by hymn verses at the beginning and end, which are called chorales. And so what we're going to actually do is the 2 chorales that frame that cantata. And even though those chorales are kind of plain and they're simple, beautiful, but kind of simple, traditional by that time, by the 1740s and 60s Lutheran music, what came between them, just as an FYI, was much fancier and more operatic. And so the folks at Trinity in 1766 really went out of their way to put on something special. And so I think the hymns are actually a good selection. John picked them. John and I were in conversation about what to do, what to pull out. They're more appropriate, I think, to a Presbyterian church, because back then Presbyterians were hymn-focused and not so much into the more elaborate music. The first hymn, it talks about Christ staying with the congregation, and then the second hymn is much more somber. It's in a minor key, and it's it's saying evening has come, and it's a request for Christ's word to stay with the people. Back in the day, actually, at least in Germany, congregations often sang these chorale verses. So if we were transported back to the 18th century, you might be singing these along with us. That's not going to work now, but just as an FYI. So basically, the concluding hymn, people were kind of afraid of the dark back then, and so they would do all kinds of things to compensate for that. So I think that's enough introduction.
Bye.
Thank you. I want to turn now to the historian's report and to Portia Bryan and to Margie Sue Lisi. And I think, Portia, you're going to give the report. And Margie Sue. Margie Sue, yeah. Would you please come up forward. You can come up here.
You want to go up there?
No, it's very short.
Okay.
Well, welcome to our first in-person reunion since 2019, which was the 106th reunion in 2019. In April of 2020, the executive board voted to cancel the reunion, which would have been in June 2020 because of COVID. Again, then in 2021, the pandemic again forced us to abandon the in-service reunion, but under the direction of Larry Chotner, we did have the reunion by Zoom, and that would have been the 107th reunion. The executive committee continued to conduct meetings by way of Zoom, and finally, in January of 2022, the executive board was able to have an in-person workshop. So you can see we have not been meeting in person for a long time. The only other Donegal Society reunion meeting that was canceled was during World War II. So in all those years, that was the only time that there was no reunion. Because of this pandemic, the subsequent and the church closing, the historians really have been very restricted with any normal work. There were many tour requests that were not able to be filled. There have been several requests for assistance with research that were able to be fulfilled by way of our files downstairs. The church in 2021, the church was finally reopened, and the church began to celebrate the 300th anniversary, which many of you have attended some of those events. So it has not, it's been a very different year, but now Portia's she's really our first historian, is going to add something to this short report.
I have to say first that the day after Margie Sue and I wrote that report saying that we'd had no request for people to come, I got a call from Philadelphia with a man who wanted to bring himself and some people he's related to from St. Louis to the church. So perhaps that is opening up again. And for those of you who are visiting, we do open the church for tours and are happy to give them to you. I'm going to meet with those people on Tuesday. So I think maybe we'll be back on track and be a little more active. I have to say also that I put a few things on Facebook as we were preparing after the pies were baked and the flowers were made. So I put them on Facebook, and last night I opened up my Facebook and I had this greeting that said, "Greetings from Donegal Town, Ireland." And I thought, well, is this a scam, first of all? And then I thought, no, this is legit. So she and I had a nice conversation, and she actually lives in Donegal Town, which is next door to Rathmini, which is where our ancestral church is. And we were back and forth, and I think her last comment to me was, I believe a few years ago that there were some people from your church who came and visited and planted a witness tree. So she knew very well, or it was just kind of a neat connection, and I'm sure when I open up my phone again, I'll find something from her. As you may have heard, Donegal celebrated 300 years of a church serving this community. You cannot be in this sanctuary without feeling the history. I can walk and I can touch the communion table, which served us in the original log church in the cemetery. So it's pre-1740. It had a visit to Winterthur a number of years ago. But it's back. Our communion set, which dates back to the late 1600s and the 1700s, is right here. I can touch a pulpit, which was made when this church was built, 1740. It used to be over there on the north wall, but when the church changed its orientation, this is where it came. And on the wall behind Larry, you can see a Celtic cross. And that was made from the floorboards of the church, the original church in Rathneeny. It was brought here by Ruth Gantos in 1985. So, as I said, right here, just touching. You're welcome to come and look at these things. We're very glad at Donegal to have things. A lot of our early records are gone, but we have things that we can touch, and we hold them with a lot of respect. As we were preparing for the 300 celebration, I touched base with the minister, Reverend Stephen Richmond, who is the current minister at the Rathneeny Church. Now, they don't worship in the ancestral church anymore, but he's going to take you into that church. He agreed to prepare a video, which we have shown at the homecoming, so that you could see our ancestral church. Our ancestors were Scots-Irish. Our Donegal heritage is the Scots-Irish. When the Scots-Irish arrived here, there were others living here. And they had to learn to live together. And I think that will take us to Dr. Marlene Arnold's speech or presentation, where she's going to tell us about how many cultures we had in this area. Our Scots-Irish ancestors came in between 1740 and 1720. Now I'm going to ask you to direct your attention over here, and David's going to play the video. Thank you, David.
So hello to you all, and it's a pleasure for me to be able to join with you from Rathneeny Presbyterian Church, County Donegal, Ireland. This church building is where some of your founding members left this area, left this congregation to travel across and begin a new community in your area, and it's a pleasure for us to be able to just join with you in your 300-year celebration, and we are delighted to have this opportunity just to say hello from Ireland. We had to have connections over the years. Outside the church here, just to my right, is the witness tree that was planted in 1974 when I was just a baby. Some of your members came here and met with the congregation here and planted that tree. You can see the trees now sort of blossoming out over the top of the church. And the congregation here, we use the building about 4 times a year. Unfortunately, due to COVID over the last number of months, we haven't had a service here for about 18 months now. But we're hoping to have maybe a Harvest Thanksgiving service again in October. So it's a pleasure for us, your brothers and sisters here, for me on their behalf, to be able to bring greetings to you, to bring our warmest congratulations on your 300 years, and to simply wish you God's richest blessing as you look forward to the future. So congratulations on your history. Congratulations on your being able to celebrate today with this online service. and we simply want to encourage you to continue on in his service, isn't it? The writer to the Hebrews says, encourage one another. Don't forget meeting together. It's been a privilege to be able to meet with you in these days using this technology, and we want to encourage you and spur you on to continue in your love and service for Jesus in the years and decades to come. May you know his blessing. As he's kept you in the past, may he keep you today, and may he lead you into the future. So from all of us here, on behalf of the congregation, I simply wish you his richest blessing and our congratulations, and may he surround you and keep you. God bless. Thank you.
Margie, Sue, and Portia, thank you. And thank you for sharing that with us. That's wonderful to see those connections. And I think even wonderful to see that that tree that stood out there is standing there now. It is now my great pleasure to introduce our speaker for this afternoon. Marlene Arnold is no stranger to the Donegal Society. She serves on the executive committee and is, in fact, a past president. Today, she comes to talk about the Providence Project, an endeavor that she has created, a story that communicates the importance of Lancaster and the surrounding area to the founding of this nation and the core values that have guided it. You'll hear more about that in just a few moments. And while her academic achievements are significant and they speak for themselves, and you can read about them in today's program, I do want to add that Dr. Arnold's mother, Mary Jane Sullenberger Arnold, was born in the house across the road from this church. Isn't that right? Her grandparents lived there for 45 years, and her mother helped to prepare meals for the Donegal Society on a number of occasions. Her mother's father, Wilmer Grant Sullenberger, built the small stone arch bridge across the stream behind the Cameron estate, and so has a part of the history of this particular place where we are gathered today. Before moving to Lancaster, Marlene would regularly visit her grandparents, and she could often be found playing on the church grounds and feeding the fish in the spring. In other words, she's got roots here, or like they used to say up in Mifflin County, she's got roots here. Right, Marlene? Yes. Please, my friends, join me in welcoming Dr. Marlene Arnold. Marlene.
Good afternoon. Thank you for coming, and I really appreciate this opportunity to talk about the Providence Project, which is about a 10-year research project that's involved a number of faculty. The most important one, Dr. Tanya Kevorkian, professor of history, is a collaborator, and many, many students, more than 60 students at Millersville University, have been involved with this project. So the project is looking at all the cultures, the many different kinds of people who were here in Lancaster and southeastern Pennsylvania in the decades leading up to the American Revolution. There were easily 15 cultures, and on the movement of Native Americans throughout the region, sometimes there were 20 different cultural groups in what was then Lancaster County, speaking different languages. So before I get into some of that material, though, I wanted to share with you how all of this began for me. A number of years ago, I met a philosopher, Jacob Needleman. He teaches at San Francisco State University. And when I met him, he was writing this book, The American Soul, Rediscovering the Wisdom of the Founders. And he told me, he was so delighted when he heard I was from Lancaster County, he told me that our original American values arose here in Lancaster County, in small communities like Ephrata and communities like here at Donegal. He told me an amazing story, an encounter by the religious leader of the Ephrata community and General George Washington at Valley Forge. And I was so captivated by the story that I started to read for fun more and more history of the 18th century in our region. And ultimately, I was so inspired by the events and the people that I wanted to pull it all together into a grand saga to tell our role, the history of our ancestors and all the people here in the birth of this nation. So I'm in the process of completing a book. The title of the book will not be the Providence Project, though it will be Conestoga, in order to highlight and draw attention to the Native Americans who were here. And I hope also that we might have a TV series made eventually after the book. Now, the research project was called the Providence Project because that word Providence worked for both the European settlers and for the Native Americans who were here. So the definition of the word is that it is the protective power of God, which worked for the Europeans coming here for religious freedom and saw God as providing protective care. But the word providence also then worked for Native Americans who viewed nature as a spiritual power providing protective care. My attraction to and immersion in this work is very much tied to this land. Larry indicated a little bit, maybe very specifically to this particular place on Earth. I'm not exactly sure when I became clearly aware of my connection to the land here in Lancaster County, but it was definitely in my childhood, sometime in the 1960s, that I became deeply rooted to this place on Earth. My family did not live in Lancaster County, but we came to visit my grandparents and other relatives here several times a year. And in the summer, as you all know, the farmland, the cornfields, it's very captivating. And even at Thanksgiving and Christmas, the place was barren but beautiful under heavy snow. Of great interest to me, and still prominent to any visitor to Lancaster County, were its people. And as Larry mentioned, here in Donegal Springs, just across the road in that house, lived my mother's parents, Whitmer Grant Sullenberger and Elizabeth Forney Scher Sullenberger. She was of French and Swiss descent, and he was of German descent, and they were plain people belonging to the Church of the River Brethren and Brethren in Christ. My father was born in Maytown, and his parents, Elizabeth Stoner Lindemuth Arnold and Mervyn Smith Arnold, were also of German descent, but they were not plain. They were lifelong members of the Maytown Church of God. And in the history of Lancaster, when we look at all the peoples and cultures in the 18th century, one thing that was very significant to people was their religious identification, perhaps more so than the different languages they were speaking. I was fascinated by the cemetery here at Donegal, with gravestones dating back to the 1700s. One of those stones has marked the grave of Reverend James Anderson, the first pastor here at Donegal. That stands at the entrance to the cemetery. Another bears the name Colonel Alexander Lowry, a member of this Scots-Irish congregation who was a distinguished soldier during the American Revolution. And then there were a number of smaller, deeply weathered stones that bore no visible markings of any kind, no chiseled names, dates, or inscriptions. These, I learned, were Indian grave markers that long predated the more formal marble slabs. Equally captivating to me as a child was the huge grand white oak that stood out here in front of the church, believed to have been 300 to 400 years old, and that everyone knew as the witness tree. In front of the tree, and it's still out there was a large stone set with a bronze plaque with an inscription reading, "Beneath this witness tree, a newborn patriotism found notable expression." and the plaque lists the names of 62 families associated with the Donegal Church at the time of the American Revolution. Members of some of those families, as the story goes, had gathered round that tree one Sunday morning in the late summer of 1777 after learning that the British had left New York to invade Pennsylvania, and they pledged their allegiance to the revolutionary cause. General Washington's troops needed help, and that morning, those men under our tree vowed to join militia, and many did go off to fight. Bailey, Cameron, Craig, Galbraith, Lowry, Patterson. The story of those people around that massive tree was very, very much alive to me. I felt as if I could step right into the past from where I stood before that towering oak. I loved my time spent with my grandparents here in Donegal Springs and Maytown, and some years later, when I took a position at Millersville University, I found myself here in the land of my ancestors, and I became interested in all the different cultural groups of people who had settled this land, and I was drawn to telling their stories from their own points of view. About 10 years into my career, my sister and a friend of ours came here for a visit. We spent time at Donegal Springs talking about our work and our careers, and I began to think about what is my life's work? What might my calling be beyond teaching and academic duties? I found myself thinking about my long-standing desire to tell the stories of my ancestors. And on our last evening together, which was Sunday, June 2nd, 1991, we sat beneath the witness tree, and I made my pledge to seek my calling, which I felt was somehow related to that grand old tree. And how would I even know what that date was? Well, because the next morning, to my utter shock and dismay, that tree, which had been nearly 50 years old in 1777, when the Donegal members circled under it to pledge their loyalty to liberty, that tree was cut down. And I do want to say that the society and the church, great effort was made to save it, but it was just too old. So in this Providence Project, which I'm going to share about the Scots-Irish part of it with you, and the book that I'm completing, I hope that I can, in a way, bring that tree and the people who lived under its influence to life once more. But those people include others, not just the European immigrants who settled here. Native Americans were living on this land for thousands of years before those first Europeans arrived, and they surely visited these springs down here, Donegal Springs, that yield a flow of water equal to 3 million gallons a day. This land and these springs were in use by Native Americans when the Scots-Irish first arrived. So in order to tell about the founding of our nation, to tell the story of the people of this place, we must understand this world before Europeans made their entrance. So the real story starts much, much earlier. In fact, archaeological evidence shows that the earliest Native Americans to be in what today is Pennsylvania dates to 16,250 years ago. So it's really quite old. We have in our own Lancaster, that's in Western PA, in our Lancaster region, we have Native Americans for quite a long time. I'm wearing a figure taken from the petroglyphs near Safe Harbor in the Susquehanna that was made, those petroglyphs were made by Native Americans 1,000 years ago. A Millersville University student made these for the Providence Project. There were hundreds and hundreds of Native American cultures and languages in North America when Europeans arrived. Unfortunately, these Europeans introduced new diseases to this continent, which resulted in the death of millions of Native Americans who suffered also the loss of their land and cultures and endured an endless cycle of displacement and conflicts at the hands of the new European immigrants. And I must mention and it is addressed in the book. Also, of course, the tragedy of the innumerable African cultures that were destroyed, crushed in those people who were captured, enslaved, and brought to this continent. But I believe if we can revisit how this nation came into being and try to understand what really happened, what was lost as well as what was gained, we have a chance to set in motion the healing of the wounds that resulted from the destruction of so many peoples and cultures during the founding of America. A Pueblo Indian elder and friend of mine, Larry Littlebird, has suggested that what we need now in our nation is a starting over story. In speaking about how to begin to make sense of all that has transpired across this land during our history, Littlebird said, quote, "We can gather round and listen. The good healing power of great stories requires," he said, "story listeners who breathe on them with the kind of breath that comes from the spirit still alive in the land." It is my hope that this project and the resulting book will be a healing story. I hope to offer a starting over story, an opportunity to look again at our beginnings in order to honor who we are and to respect one another. Indeed, the word respect comes from the Latin word respicere, which means the willingness to look again. A desired outcome of this work, then, is the building of a bridge between our contemporary society and stories of our past that might allow us to gain a new understanding of who we are and of our place in the world. So in looking at all of these peoples and cultures, I just want to point out that, of course, the Scots-Irish Presbyterians were a very important group here. There were also Quakers, as well as those Presbyterians from England and Ireland, German-speaking Mennonites, and others from different faiths from the Rhine River Valley, including French Huguenots. There also were Jews. There were German gypsies, more properly referred to as Roma. They were a very important group in early Lancaster County. They were sometimes called Black Dutch. There was another cultural group, Melungeons. These are people who are mixed descent, Native, European, and Roma. We had as well, in early Lancaster, free Africans as well as enslaved Africans. And all these people were here together speaking all their different languages, figuring out how to communicate with each other. And they had all of their different cultures, but they shared their knowledge. They shared what we might call their best practices, not only for survival, but for right living, for ethical behavior, for moral conduct. And this rich agricultural land and the surrounding wilderness filled with game and other resources in combination with all of these different cultures provided a very fertile substratum for both economic and social prosperity. And this cultural blending that gave rise to a new way of living together. These new combinations resulted in the birth of America with its own form of democracy and its own distinctive values. So very central to the birth of this nation were the Scots-Irish Presbyterians. Approximately 100,000 Scots-Irish migrated to the colonies between 1718 and 1755. One researcher describes this wave of migration as the single largest movement of any group from the British Isles to British North America in the 18th century. And of course, Pennsylvania, with its religious tolerance, abundant economic resources, and we even had an organized presbytery in Philadelphia as early as 1706, this became an important point, a principal migration destination of the Scots-Irish. This immigration occurred steadily throughout the 18th century, but there were two significant peaks in Scots-Irish migration here. It occurred in the late 1710s and 1720s, and the second peak was during the mid-1760s and early 1770s. And as many of you know, a number of Donegal early settlers arrived during that first wave of Scots-Irish migration. Now, the settlers along the Susquehanna River, to the north of Lancaster and the western frontier, these were mostly Scots-Irish. But they didn't end up there by accident. In fact, James Logan, secretary to William Penn, had a plan, and he encouraged them to come and settle in the hinterland for a specific purpose, in order to serve as a buffer between Indians and the pacifist Anabaptists and Germans. And I do want to just, since I'm going to be interchangeably using the term Indian and Native American, I want to explain about the term Indian. During the Indian rights movement in the 1960s and leading into the 1970s, the US government, it was the US government that proposed the term Native American. And they wanted to underscore, there was a good purpose, they wanted to underscore that these were the original people on the continent, the indigenous people, but the term Native American was never widely accepted by American Indians, who preferred to be referred to by the name of their own group or tribe. The label Native American was further rejected when it was used to divert federal funding originally intended for American Indians to groups like Native Hawaiians, who are Polynesian and are not American Indian. So I just wanted to clarify that it's okay to use the word Indian, and I will be doing it interchangeably. So the Scots-Irish were sent out to be a buffer between the Indians and the pacifists, the Anabaptist Germans, the British Quakers in Lancaster County. And in fact, Scots-Irish had a similar role back in Northern Ireland, serving as a military and cultural buffer between the Anglicans and the Catholics. Now, the Scots-Irish settlers saw settlement at first as a kind of moral duty because they believed that Indians were not using the land as God and nature intended. The Scots-Irish became increasingly assertive about squatting on a property. They did not, many of them, seek the appropriate legal permissions. And on occasion, they did resort to violence to keep the land. But sometimes when they were challenged, they just moved on to another plot and started to settle there. So this made, since the Scots-Irish were out in the hinterland and the Pennsylvania frontier, it made them really susceptible, really vulnerable after the French and Indian War. So there's so much that could be discussed about the Scots-Irish during the 18th century in Pennsylvania. But due to the time constraints, I'm going to focus on the French and Indian War and how that directly impacted the Scots-Irish, and that ultimately led to the tragedy many of you know of, the Conestoga Indian Massacre, which I won't speak about today, but I'll move forward then to come back here to the Donegal Church in 1777. So the French and Indian War, which was 1754 to 1763, really marked the end of any hope for a positive relationship between the colonists and Native Americans in Pennsylvania. William Penn had founded the colony on a vision of what he called good correspondence among the diverse groups in his territory, and he hoped that his long peace would continue indefinitely. Indeed, as a result of William Penn's vision, Pennsylvania did have a lot fewer conflicts between the Europeans and Native Americans. But in fact, by 1754, things had been deteriorating for some years, and there was now a point of no return reached. When war broke out between France and Great Britain, the Native American groups supported one side or the other in their attempts at self-preservation or in holding on to their territory or in trying to gain some new territory. And while there were many Native American groups involved in the French and Indian War, from the perspective of the Pennsylvania colonial government, the two that they focused on were the Lenape and the Shawnee, who in the beginning of the war did not take sides, but ultimately they sided with the French. The conflict started in 1754 with a number of regional confrontations beginning in western Pennsylvania, where the French were taking control. But the next year, in 1755, the British sent General Edward Braddock to take command of the military in North America and to reassert British authority over the frontier. Now, Braddock arrived in Alexandria, Virginia, and he had British infantry, artillery, and he was preparing for his first mission to capture Fort Duquesne in the western part of Pennsylvania. The governors of Maryland and Virginia had pledged Braddock that they would provide wagons, pack horses, and supplies for the long march. But those Virginians and the Maryland governor as well failed. They did not fulfill their promises, and Braddock was enraged, and he declared that he was going to seize whatever he needed from the people of Virginia. But enter our very own Ben Franklin, who heard about the impending debacle, and by the way, he heard about it by chatting with someone at a post office. He stepped up to play the role of mediator, and he went to Braddock and said, you know, what a pity you and your troops didn't land in Philadelphia, because in Pennsylvania, quote, every farmer has his wagon, and they would have gladly given them up to you. And so to prove it, Franklin published and distributed a broadside advertisement calling on, quote, the inhabitants of the counties of Lancaster, York, and Cumberland to provide wagons and teams and pack horses for General Braddock's army. And soon, Pennsylvania farmers, with their wagons and horses, were on the march towards Braddock's position. Franklin even got his friend, Susanna Wright, who was here in Columbia, down by the river. You can visit the Wright's Ferry Mansion. She and her family got involved, even though they were Quakers and pacifists. They gathered up supplies for Braddock, and then with their Wright's Ferry Mansion, they took everything that Braddock needed across the river here in Columbia. So now adequately equipped, Braddock's army had about 2,000 troops, most of them British, but also had soldiers and militiamen from the colonies, including many Scots-Irish. It was especially in Pennsylvania with so many pacifists, it's the Scots-Irish who were stepping up to fight. They set out from Maryland, from Fort Cumberland, May 29, 1755. Now, it's a very interesting story because names we recognized were involved. So Daniel Boone was with them. He was serving as a blacksmith and a wagoner. And George Washington was there too. He was just 22 or 23 years old, and he was volunteering as an aide-de-camp to General Braddock. There were only 8 Indians in the company, and they were serving as scouts. And this is because Braddock declared that Indians weren't necessary. Some of the Pennsylvanians were adamant, but no local Indians nor Lenape would join them. So the scouts that they had were Seneca and Cayuga. So the men wagons, cannon, they pressed slowly over the Allegheny Mountains, marching through the dense woods of western Pennsylvania towards the forks of the Ohio. Fort Duquesne was garrisoned only by about 250 regulars and Canadian militia. And then outside of the fort, there were 640 Indian allies camped. Braddock expected that he would be able to easily take the fort and could then swiftly march north, attacking other French positions along the way. But that's not how it happened. The fort's commander received reports from Indian scouts that the British were on their way with thousands of men and heavy cannon. The commander, realizing that he could not withstand such an onslaught, surprised the British with a ferocious attack that lasted several hours and left nearly 1,000 British forces killed or wounded, mainly by friendly fire. The French and Indians, on the other hand, suffered only 40 casualties. General Braddock had 4 horses shot out from under him. He was wounded, carried off the field, and died several days later. The British survivors fled. The French took possession of the abandoned supplies, equipment, and cannons. They even seized Braddock's official papers, which included the British war plans. And then Washington, our George Washington, who came out of the scrimmage completely unscathed, led the retreat of the remaining British troops to winter quarters in Philadelphia. Daniel Boone barely escaped alive and set out on foot to rejoin his family in North Carolina, where they had settled after leaving Pennsylvania in 1750. And a great story, which I don't have time to share today, but you know the Boones were here, and Abraham Lincoln's grandparents. And they were on farms next to each other, and the two families intermarried. And so when Daniel Boone's dad was thrown out of his Quaker meeting because he would not insist that his daughter apologize for marrying a non-Quaker, I'm digressing, but they were thrown out, so the Boone family left Lancaster County, went south to Kentucky and beyond, and so the Lincolns followed, and that's how Abraham Lincoln's family ended up in Illinois. Okay, so Daniel Boone, he did survive this, walked home to North Carolina, but virtually all the wagons and horses that the Pennsylvania farmers provided were lost. They were destroyed. And of the 50 or so women who had accompanied the British as maids or cooks, only 4 survived. So this defeat of Braddock near Fort Duquesne, it was known as the Battle of the Monongahela, July 9, 1755, was disastrous for the British, but was also disastrous for the Scots-Irish, because it left the backwoods of Pennsylvania, of the British territory, undefended. And so, as you recall, that's where the Scots-Irish are settled. And they were out there with their families, having to fend for themselves. So the Pennsylvania frontier, after Braddock's defeat, the Pennsylvania frontier erupted into violence. Relations between the European settlers and Indians, which had been historically peaceful, now became characterized by suspicion and violence. There were small raiding parties of Lenape and Shawnee, usually with one French officer. They attacked isolated cabins, hoping to drive settlers off the land. The war's effect on the communities all along the Susquehanna River was devastating. Tensions swelled, hostilities erupted, stories of Indian massacres to the north along the river were rampant in Lancaster, which was filling up with refugees as the frontier settlers from the surrounding regions panicked and fled south. As frightened settlers sought to escape these Indians, swarmed into Lancaster, local residents became alarmed, and this series of events, these several years, are really what ultimately fueled the massacre of the Conestoga Indians in Conestoga town and also at the Fulton. Well, the French and Indian War then officially ended with the signing of the Treaty of Paris in 1763. The violence wasn't over because it was in December of 1763 that Conestoga Indian massacre happened at the hands of an angry gang of Scots-Irish Presbyterians called the Paxton Boys. So I'm sure if you're from around here, you know the details of that event. I do cover it in my book extensively. There's also another piece of Scots-Irish history I'm not going to talk about, but before the Paxton Boys, there were the Panther Boys. And that's a very interesting Scots-Irish piece as well. But I want to get back to Donegal Presbyterian. The Scots-Irish here, like the Scots-Irish out in the frontier of Pennsylvania, played a key role in these conflicts and confrontations, but of course a very important role was the one they played in the American Revolution, where they could really bring forth their valor, their bravery, their prowess to do battle for, as it says on the plaque, the cause of liberty and the founding of a new nation. So let's turn our attention to that story. I suppose that Sunday morning in August 1777 was pretty much like many of the summer mornings I spent at my grandmother's house across the way here in the 1960s. Very warm, stifling, and still, the air heavy with humidity. Inside the church sanctuary, perhaps the only sound to be heard in the silent pauses of the sermon were a few flies buzzing lazily. I envision the Scottish Presbyterian pastor, Colin MacFarquhar, who, by the way, one of the very first students I talked to about this was a 5th generation descendant of Colin MacFarquhar, and she also babysat my children. But that was very neat to bring her here. And she said, oh, you know, we know Colin MacFarquhar. It's forever a very small world. Anyway, Colin MacFarquhar was preaching that day, and I imagined that he was a reserved man, but would deliver sermons with some power and authority. But during the service on that particular Sunday morning, the sound of pounding horses' hooves rapidly approaching suddenly broke the silence of prayer. The parishioners lifted their heads when they heard the rider's boot hit the ground and run towards the church. And we have those heavy latches we can imagine back there. The sound of the latch on the heavy door announced the arrival of the messenger, who barged in and called out, "Is Colonel Lowry here? I have an urgent request to muster his battalion." Lowry was sitting in the rear of the sanctuary. Okay, I don't know that, I made that up. But he was in here, I just don't know that. "The British are advancing on Philadelphia," barked the messenger. "We need your militia to mobilize. Reinforcements are needed." As with all such iconic stories that have been passed down through generations, there are varying accounts about what happened next. In the earliest recorded version, which wasn't actually even written until 1870, Reverend MacFarquhar apparently earnestly tried to calm his congregation, pleading with them not to answer the call to arms and to remain loyal to the King of England. But Colonel Lowry and several other prominent church members rebuked him and led the congregation out of the church, where they gathered beneath that large white, well, it was 50 years old then, that white oak tree, and pledged to fight for American independence. Now, in a later version of the story, published in 1896, the congregation forcibly brought MacFarquhar to the oak tree, formed a circle around him, chastised him for his fealty to the crown, and bullied him to, quote, "shout for the patriot cause." Okay. Both versions are probably somewhat fictitious, derived from legend. While MacFarquhar might have been unenthusiastic about American independence, it is unlikely that he would have called for loyalty to the King of England. By 1777, the conflict that had begun with shots fired by Minutemen in Lexington and Concord had become a full-scale war against the occupying British forces. The First Continental Congress, which convened in Philadelphia in September 1774, had declared America's rights of freedom. The Second Continental Congress, again held in Philadelphia, the delegates, including Thomas Jefferson and Ben Franklin, they voted to raise an army and chose George Washington as its leader. Then came the battles, first at Boston's Bunker Hill, followed by Fort Ticonderoga in New York. In July of 1776, the Continental Congress issued the Declaration of Independence, and in response, the British dispatched tens of thousands more troops, led by General William Howe. The British forces routed the colonists from New York and then moved towards Washington's army stationed near the Chesapeake Bay. So in that summer of 1777, it was really a rare colonist who sided with the British, or at least who would admit doing so. What's more, it's very unlikely, given his background, that Pastor MacFarquhar himself was a sympathizer with the British crown. He was a Scot, and the Scottish and the British had long been adversaries. MacFarquhar was a believer in America, having left his home in Scotland to emigrate just 3 years earlier. Reverend Reverend McFarquhar was born in 1729 in the Scottish Highlands, where he spent his childhood. He studied at the University of Aberdeen. He was an ordained minister of the Church of Scotland in 1759, and for 14 years served as the pastor of a parish there. But life grew increasingly difficult for McFarquhar and his family, and so in April of 1774, at the age of 45, he secured permission from the Presbytery of Gairloch in the Highlands of Scotland to visit the American colonies. So McFarquhar bid farewell to his wife and 5 children, and after a stormy voyage across the Atlantic, eventually made his way to Pennsylvania, where he met with the Donegal Presbytery, which received him as a corresponding member and authorized him to serve as a supply pastor, which meant that he could offer himself to preach any Sunday to any church in the presbytery, or any church could invite him on any particular Sunday. But then in April 1776, Reverend McFarquhar officially accepted a call to become the pastor of Donegal Presbyterian Church. He was promised the sum of £100 annually, and the use of the glebe, that is a plot of land that belongs to the congregation, so that he and his family could farm, and the produce from that land would support the pastor and the congregation. And I would like to just add that the house that my grandmother was born in, the boundary line behind it is a bit of a triangle, and over to the Cameron Estate lands, this was the glebe land. So Cameron Estate, Donegal, and my grandparents were part of this glebe land. Well, he waited for his family to join him. McFarquhar boarded at Samuel Scott's Tavern on Big Chickies Creek, which was about 2 miles from the glebe. He would have likely been very disheartened at the time had he known that his wife Elizabeth and their daughters would not join him in Donegal until 1785. The messenger's urgent call for recruits for Washington's army that summer day in 1777 could not have come as much, it certainly was not a surprise to McFarquhar nor to the congregation, because for years it had been a constant struggle to get enough men to join up and fight, especially again here in Lancaster County, where there were many pacifist religious groups. In December 1744, a 60-member Lancaster County of Observation and Correspondence had been formed, with elected representatives from each township, and Lowry was one of its members. The Lancaster County Committee revived the voluntary military associations that had first been formed in 1747 to defend against threats by the French and their Indian allies. So they called on the inhabitants of each township, quote, to associate and provide themselves with arms and ammunition and learn the act of military discipline. Ben Franklin had actually suggested that, okay, we're calling on these people to associate, so as to not upset all the pacifists so much in his colony, in this colony, Ben Franklin suggested that they be called associators, not soldiers. So they were referred to as associators, and then those who refused to join were known as non-associators. And as the war momentum increased, tensions rose between the two groups. And in fact, there's an amazing story that there were plenty of scrimmages that resulted from non-associators heckling or demonstrating against associators while they were practicing their military drills. And on this road from Donegal Springs to Maytown, there was one such scrimmage between associators and non-associators in which someone was shot and killed. As the revolution gathered momentum and the need for troops increased dramatically, it became clear that a more formal military organization and recruitment process was needed. So in March of 1777, the Pennsylvania Assembly passed the Militia Act, which required all able-bodied men ages 18 to 53 to enroll for military service. Each county would appoint a lieutenant, and sub-lieutenants would be responsible for forming a militia. To serve as Lancaster County's first lieutenant the Pennsylvania Assembly chose Donegal church member Colonel Bertram Galbraith. But he also found it difficult to raise a force because there were so many non-associators in Lancaster who just would not participate based on religious grounds. But Galbraith also encountered some resistance, or at least trouble, from Scots-Irish, because in order to become an associator, you had to be able to speak English to speak to everyone, and many of the Scots-Irish only spoke Gaelic. So no wonder by August of that year, the British headed toward a confrontation with Washington's troops. The pressure was really on to serve. And Colonel Lowry, along with many of his fellow parishioners, indeed answered the call of that messenger. As they trudged south toward a river tributary known as Brandywine Creek, they could not know that they were about to engage in one of the most significant battles of the American War for Independence. And while the Battle of Brandywine was lost by the colonial forces on September 11, 1777, we all, of course, know the outcome of the War for Independence. And that outcome was to a great part due to the involvement and the steadfastness of the Scots-Irish soldiers. So what was that inspiring story that Jacob Needleman told me long ago about Ephrata and General George Washington? To close, I want to share that with you. This is after the Battle of Brandywine is lost, and the way that the story goes, wounded from the Battle of Brandywine were taken to what we call the Ephrata Cloister, but that was called the Ephrata Community. But I do want to point out that although everyone believes that, the wounded actually were not taken to the cloister, although later the cloister did take care of many wounded. It was an early evening on a cold, blustery November day, again, 1777. A few townsmen were warming themselves by the fireplace in a small tavern room in Ephrata, cupping their hands around their pewter mugs filled with local whiskey. Michael Widman, the tavern owner, was working on the fire, which was pouring smoke into the room. It had been raining for days and the logs were damp. He opened a window to air out the smoke when the sound of horses arrived and two men entered the tavern asking for lodging. Widman arranged for rooms and invited the two to sit for supper. He showed them to the table by the window where the air was clearer. It was 1777 and General Howe and the British had taken Philadelphia after Brandywine in that September. The tavern was a short distance from the Ephrata settlement founded by Conrad Beissel. Michael Widman had lived in Ephrata all of his life, and like a number of other townsfolk, he took a very dim view of those strange religious people that had sprung up along the Cocalico Creek. Widman was a prominent member of the German Reformed Church, Lutheran Church, and the mystical community on the Cocalico had attracted many members away from their church to join the followers of Beissel. Michael Widman was particularly resentful over the loss of their brilliant young pastor, Peter Miller, who had been drawn away by Beissel some 40 years earlier and had become one of Beisel's most devoted followers. And then when Beissel died in 1768, Peter Miller stepped in to be the new leader of the Ephrata community. Michael Widman so disliked Peter Miller that he took every opportunity to show it. On one occasion, he physically assaulted him. It was said once that Widman even spit in the venerable elder's face. Now, this tavern owner, Widman, he was a fervent supporter of the Revolution. He had even served as head of the Lancaster County Committee of Safety. Those were groups organized in the counties to support the Revolution. After serving those two visitors some warm stew his wife was famous for, Widman paused to chat with them. He was standing with his back to that open window when he asked them about their journey, and upon hearing that they had come from Philadelphia, Widman blurted out, "So how's that wretched scoundrel, General Howe, getting along?" However, it turned out those two visitors were British scouts who had come undercover seeking information about the Ephrata community to which they had heard Washington sent wounded after the Battle of Brandywine. One of the men angrily defended Howe, the other sprang to his feet, drawing a pistol from his coat, and Widman threw himself backwards out of the window into the night. The scouts followed, but Widman was able to escape into the darkness. At first, he hid among dead corn stalks in a field nearby, then he made his way to the banks of the Cocalico Creek, but no place seemed like it would be a good place to be hiding when daybreak arrived. So he decided to go to the Ephrata community that he so despised. He went there. He knew the buildings were never locked at night. He crept into the brother's house and found an upper loft unoccupied where he hid behind a stack of chimneys for 3 days and 3 nights without food and water. Widman decided that his situation was without hope and that the only chance he had for survival was to go to General Howe and seek his pardon. So late on the 4th night, he quietly made his way out of the brother's house and hurried to his home to tell his wife his plan. He gathered some provisions, a small amount of money for the journey to Philadelphia, and fled at once under the cover of night. The following evening, he arrived at General Howe's quarters and told the guards that he urgently needed to speak to the general. Widman was led to the general's chambers, but due to the overwhelming anxiety he was feeling, he became flustered and could not speak at first when the general asked him who he was. But eventually, when Widman could talk, he just started to ask for forgiveness for embracing the rebel cause, and he explained that if he was assured a pardon, that he would divulge important secret information in the locations of hidden ammunitions being used against the British in the Lancaster area. While Widman was speaking, 2 officers were leafing through a ledger book, scanning the entries of incidents. Before General Howe could reply, one of the officers moved the book closer to the general with his finger pointing to a paragraph on the open page. The general quickly read the entry and exclaimed, "So you must be Michael Widman." Widman fell to his knees and pleaded for mercy. He declared that he would do anything that the general asked of him against the Americans. Now, although the British usually encouraged rebels to defect, General Howe was disgusted that a man who had held a leadership position among the revolutionaries would so easily turn against them. Howe declared that such a treacherous, cowardly man who so readily returned against his own people could never be trusted by the British in their cause. General Howe decided to send Widman away, ordered his officers to deliver Widman safely beyond British lines. Now, shortly after Widman had left his home the night before, his wife alerted the revolutionaries, and word spread quickly about Widman's treasonous intentions. So all the American stations were on the lookout for him. And in fact, Widman was seized and arrested at the very first American outpost he reached. He was taken to the blockhouse at Turk's Head, that's Westchester today. He was quickly tried and sentenced to be hanged as a traitor. The findings of this court-martial were sent to George Washington at Valley Forge. General Washington read the court-martial, approved and signed the papers for Michael Widman to be sent. He was sentenced to be hanged, and so George Washington signed off on his conviction of treason and his sentence. Now, people were in the region denouncing Widman, of course, for his treachery, except for one person who would not speak against him, Peter Miller, the prior of the Ephrata community, the very man Widman so despised. As soon as the prior heard that Widman had been arrested, he immediately set out on foot for the camp at Valley Forge, which was 60 miles away. It had already been snowing relentlessly for a day and a night, so the prior wrapped himself heavily with robes and donned a warm hood. He gathered some food and water and set out into the gray morning for a trek to the camp where he hoped to speak to General George Washington. When Peter Miller arrived at Valley Forge 3 days later, General Washington was in his command tent with several other staff officers. And upon hearing who was waiting to see him, Washington readily received Miller. The general had been very impressed by the sacrifices made by the effort of community to care for the wounded and dying after the Battle of Brandywine. And he had heard much about the sincerity of Peter Miller. The old man was ushered into the tent and stood there facing Washington and members of the command staff. Washington invited him to be seated, but Miller declined, saying that his business would not allow for a moment's delay. Quickly, he began to plead forcefully for mercy toward Michael Widman. The officers present were moved by the prior's face, his eloquence, making the case for sparing the life of Michael Widman. They fully expected Washington to be merciful and grant a pardon. When Miller finished speaking, all of those present turned to look at Washington. The general was seated at his command table, which was covered with maps and battle plans. His demeanor was regal, but his face displayed the toll taken by his responsibilities as commander-in-chief. He addressed Miller as his friend and told him that there was scarcely anything that he would deny him. However, he said, it would be fatal to their cause not to be stringent in such matters and make examples of renegades to the cause of liberty. Quote, otherwise, I would cheerfully release your friend, Washington said. The prior stood unmoving with his eyes closed. He slowly opened them and began to speak, his voice breaking. Friend? Michael Widman is not my friend. He is my worst enemy. He incessantly derides me. I might not have come to you to plead for a friend, but Widman has been my worst foe, my persecuting enemy, and my religion teaches me to pray for those who despitefully use me. There was not a sound in the tent, and minutes passed. General Washington stood up and walked around to the front of the table, standing face to face with Peter Miller. The general's eyes flooded with tears as he took the prior's hand and said, my dear friend, I thank you for this lesson of religious charity. This is one of the values we are fighting for. The pardon you have requested is granted under one condition, that you be the bearer of it yourself and hand it to the commanding officer at Turk's Head in Widman's presence. The prior accepted the condition. The general invited Miller to join them for dinner, but he declined, saying, my mission requires the utmost urgency on my part. Washington sent an aide to pack some food. The pardon was quickly prepared and handed to Peter Miller, and although night was falling, the old monk set out immediately and reached Turk's Head early the next morning after trudging through deep snow all night. So Peter Miller hastily approaches the front of the blockhouse in the gray early morning light, and he sees the faint outline of several soldiers. But again, it was still snowing, and he has difficulty seeing. As he draws closer, his heart begins to race as the scene before him becomes visible. He can clearly discern Widman standing on a step on the gallows with the rope around his neck. Miller grabs a stay of execution from his sack, waves it in the air as he rushes towards the gallows. Widman is addressing those present. He is acknowledging his treachery and the justice of his reward. At the moment Miller reaches the gallows, Widman is beseeching mercy from above. The prior steps forward and hands the commanding officer a package, whispering that it's from General George Washington, and it's in reference to this very matter before us. During this transaction, Widman sees Miller and abruptly stops praying and calls out, oh, Peter Miller, whatever has prompted your presence here, I take it as the kindest providence that I have this opportunity to take back the many abuses I committed against you and to ask you for your forgiveness. I know I have no right to seek forgiveness for such horrible treatment as I have shown to you over many years. Yet I hope that I may find pardon from above. And at this point, the commanding officer interrupts Widman and announces to him that the commander-in-chief has granted a pardon for his crime, and gesturing to Peter Miller says, "Here is your deliverer." Jacob Needleman wrote in this wonderful book, "America was once the hope of the world. This hope was more than the promise of equality and liberty, more than the promise of material prosperity and safety and security, although all of that was part of it. The deeper hope of America was its vision of what humanity is and can become, individually and in community. America was and is the promise of a new beginning." And so the stories recounted here and the many stories in the Providence Project work of people in different cultures meeting and clashing and sometimes merging, I think can provide hope and meaning and serve as a bridge to our contemporary American culture. As Americans today, it behooves us to try to understand what transpired in the birth of our nation. If we can look again at our history and understand what happened with a new appreciation of cultural conflict and of the value of cultural diversity and the richness it created, we perhaps have a chance to grow and thrive for another 250 years. But if we succumb to clashing culture wars and suppress cultural diversity and the wisdom it can bring when it's allowed to flourish, we will have lost our way as a nation. We will have squandered the very wealth upon which this country was built. As Jacob Needleman put it, America is the melting pot of all the wisdom by which all the people who have settled here sought to live by. That is our great wealth. Here in southeastern Pennsylvania, it was this complex web of so many diverse cultures from which America was born. It was the merging of the many cultures that came together, the cultural blending in the 18th century here in Penn's Woods that gave rise to America with a new form of democracy and its own values, some of which never existed before anywhere else in the world. And you had in your program a synopsis of what those values are and how they were understood in the 18th century, because some of them are interpreted differently today. Original American values, yes, arose in Ephrata, but in other small communities like here in Donegal, where people sought to care for the inner divinity and through that to care for their neighbor. This was the birth of democracy. It was this radical innovation that arose here, that is to actually act on one's beliefs, to walk your talk, that gave rise to our special form of democracy. It called for respect for the selfhood of one's neighbor. It required individuals to struggle to listen to each other, to search for community, and as Jacob Needleman put it, to engage in the hard work of thinking together. This is the basis of American democracy and of original American values. To be an American was an idea, an identity composed of values based on respect for others, all others, different cultures, different religions and faiths, speaking different languages. This is what the American Revolution was about. It was fought to create a land for all to live in with equal opportunity, respect, and freedoms. To the extent that we can re-examine and comprehend how utterly we failed, Indians and Africans, we have a chance to avail ourselves of the great gift that America offers, the promise of a new beginning. Thank you.
thank you so much. And thanks to all of you for being here today. Our hymn this afternoon is a paraphrase of Psalm 117 by Isaac Watts. All morning and now this afternoon we have been singing hymns from the 18th century. Watts, as you might know, but need maybe to recall, was born in 1674, and by the age of 15 had written his first hymn, beginning a musical revolution in Reformed worship. Known as the father of English hymnody, clearly this hymn was one that made its way to the Americas, and whether it made its way into one of the old psalters, I am not sure. Those old Presbyterians were a bit particular about their music, and some things never change. Originally written for a harvest festival service, like so many of Isaac Watts's words, it seems to fit with most occasions during the church year, and certainly on the occasion of this reunion. So let us stand together and sing From All That Dwell Below the Skies. It is hymn number 327. I would remind you all that this society reunion continues. There is a cultural fair on the grounds of the church. There's dancers and displays and opportunities for you to test your knowledge of 18th century history and culture. I hope you'll stay and go and be a part of all that, besides the dessert out there. Montgomery pie. And so please go out and enjoy the day. Marlene, thank you. And let us pray before we go. Grant us, Lord God, the vision of your kingdom, forgiveness and new life, and the stirring of your spirit, so that we may share your vision, proclaim your love, and change the world in the name of Christ our Lord. Go in peace.